This is the a7R5, Sony's latest full-frame camera. It's like an a7R4 sensor with Alpha 1 video aspirations wrapped up in an a7 IV body, but with a new tilt flip screen mechanism that's not only the best I've ever seen, but that makes the rest of my cameras seem clunky and limited by comparison. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I'm on the highway to the danger zone. For disclosure, Sony lent me this camera to make this review. I do not get to keep it, no money changed hands, and Sony does not get any input on this video's production or get to preview it before it's posted. It's like the Panasonic S1H screen in that it combines a tilt layer with a fully articulating one. However, unlike the S1H screen, this is much thinner and not only tilts up, but also down, which were the major drawbacks of that S1H display. In fact, this screen actually comes completely away from the body, not only improving its maximum tilt range, but helping with heat dissipation. And while away from the body, it's still sturdy enough to allow for easy rotation of the flip-out portion. It's truly outstanding, and I hope all future cameras from Sony use this mechanism moving forward. The rest of the body, as I said, feels identical to the a7 IV, except that this has a flash sync port behind the full-size HDMI door. But just like the a7 IV, this has all the new stuff too. So the photo, video, S&Q lever, the new menu with the focus breathing compensation, focus map, easy 1080p 60 streaming over USB-C, 10-bit color, S-Cinetone, and even the new main at-a-glance menu pages that we saw on the FX30 and FX3 2.0 firmware, including the FX30's new video on-screen display elements that are framed better around the 16:9 image, which I've really come to appreciate. Just little things like always being able to see my battery life without needing to clutter my whole screen with the rest of the elements makes a huge difference. And it also comes with the shutter sensor protector that we've seen in the last few models from Sony as well. The a7R5 basically has everything that Sony has put in their different cameras in the last couple of years, but all at once, which is nice. It's still a 61 megapixel sensor, just like the previous a7R4, but with a new autofocus system and improved IBIS. It also uses the newer processor from the Alpha 1, which Sony claims is 8 times faster than what was in the a7R4, which means we're getting a lot more recording options. As I mentioned, we have 10-bit across the board now, and we can record that all the way up to 8K at 24 frames per second. You can also record 4K up to 60 frames per second, and then oversampled 4K at 24 and 30p in an APS-C crop mode. And it's here that we're going to see the biggest difference between this camera and something like the A1, which also does 8K. This sensor just isn't as fast, and some compromises had to be made to achieve all of those resolution and frame rate combinations. And my biggest complaint about this camera is the somewhat complicated cropping, binning, and oversampling pipelines that, when combined with the added crops from things like active stabilization, made it so that I had a hard time telling what my true focal length was most of the time. So for example, to get a true full frame, full width, uncropped image, you have to shoot 4K up to 30 frames per second. This will create an image that is binned down from an over 8K sensor. This binning method is solid though, it's the same one used on the Alpha 1, and I found that image to be just as good as the a7S3's slightly oversampled 4K image. Now from here you can switch to 4K 60 if you want, which unlike the a7 IV, does not force you into an APS-C crop, and instead puts a 1.2 times crop on that full sensor to bring it down to just 8K, and then bins what's left to 4K at 60 frames per second. I assume they need to do this to be able to read out the 4K fast enough for 60p, because 4K 120 isn't even an option on this camera. So 4K 60 has a 1.2 times crop, and the 8K 24 comes from that same 1.2 times cropped 8K image, but instead of binning it down to 4K, they just deliver the 8K image at a maximum of 24 frames per second. However, it gets more complicated as you can also switch to APS-C voluntarily, which will crop in 1.5 times to a 6.2K portion of the sensor and oversample your 4K recordings from that 6.2K resolution, but you can only do this up to 30 frames per second, so there's no APS-C 60p in this camera, unlike the a7 IV. So between all of these modes, you have a full range of capability. It just requires a bit of work to keep track of it all when you're busy focused on your shoot. And this is the major advantage that the A1 has over this camera, because the Alpha 1 is so fast, you can just shoot anything and everything in full frame with no crops and no fuss, all the way up to 8K 30 and 4K 120. But the A1 is $2,500 to $2,600 more than this camera, so the price difference makes the a7R5 compromises seem quite reasonable. Naturally though, I shot my chroma subsampling chart to make sure there was nothing weird going on with the binning and oversampling, and I'm happy to report that the quality is as expected between the different modes. And the binning looks good. Here, in the 8K recording, you can see the individual blue pixels between the bands of red. And this detail is well preserved when looking at the 6.2K oversampled APS-C recordings as well. When moving to the 4K 24 full-framed binned recordings, We can see the pixel groups getting larger and conjoined, but still keeping the distinct pattern. And then finally, when moving to 4K 60, which has it the worst being both cropped and binned, we see that we lose a bit more detail, but again, still preserving the color information and most of the boundaries between blue and red. And this is at over 400% magnification. When we pull back to even 200%, I find it hard to tell the difference between them. So this is all handled well, just like the Alpha 1. Of course, rolling shutter is going to take a hit when compared to the A1 stack sensor, and the results are basically an inversion of the previous detail rankings. So the worst offenders for rolling shutter are the 8K and oversampled APS-C modes. These are going to give you results closer to the problem rolling shutter of the A7 IV, although this camera might still be a little bit faster, but still quite a bit of jello. If we switch over to the binned full-frame 4K, however, we get a better result with considerably less warping during pans, which is improved a bit more still when moving to 4K 60. These binned readout speeds are quite acceptable in my opinion, and the rolling shutter effects are tolerable in these modes. Now, I also went through and tested the battery life and overheating during each of those readout methods. For each test, I used a fully charged FZ100 battery, the same battery you'd find in any Sony full-frame mirrorless camera over the last few years, and the ambient temperature during the test was 23 Celsius or 74 Fahrenheit. The camera's temperature threshold was set to high, and the screen was pulled out and away from the body. For the 8K 24, I recorded 1 hour and 34 minutes before the battery died with no overheat warning, but the camera became extremely hot to the touch. I couldn't hold the camera at that point for longer than a minute without it getting uncomfortable. In 4K 60, I got 2 hours and 25 minutes before the battery died. Again, no overheat warning. This time, it was warm to the touch, but far cooler than the 8K recording, and it felt fine to hold. Then for 4K 24 oversampled APS-C, it lasted for 2 hours and 10 minutes before the battery died. Still, no overheat warning. It was quite warm this time, warmer than the 4K 60, holdable, but almost too hot to hold. Then lastly, the 4K 24 bin full frame gave the longest battery life at 2 hours and 33 minutes, no overheat warning, and this time it was barely warm to the touch, so no concerns in that mode. Now these results are based on my experience in my environment. Your results may be different. Sony rates their heat dissipation at 30 minutes of 8K recording. I assume those are on the safe side, but that's what they're advertising. Now, when it comes to actually recording these files, it uses the same dual double slots of the last few cameras with 2 CF Express Type A and 2 SD card slots, and all the same codec options are available, including H.265 and All Intra. I also tested the dynamic range in each of those modes. Now, considering we're using a similar sensor to the older A7R IV, I was expecting to see worse dynamic range than cameras like the A7S III, Alpha 1, and A7 IV, and my expectations were correct. But improvements elsewhere in the camera allowed us to regain some of that loss. For example, now that we have 10-bit, we can confidently record in S-Log3, which will provide some improvement over the gammas that were better suited to 8-bit cameras. And the 8K recording allows us to capture a finer noise, which is easier to hide and less noticeable when left in your shots. So starting with that 8K image, we captured 14.9 total stops in the Xyla 21, which is reflected here in Imatest beside the words slope-based DR. This is the total amount of patches that the sensor could see, but not necessarily good, clean stops. So instead, let's look at the 0.5 medium score, which tells us how many stops have a usable signal-to-noise ratio of 2. And for the 8K recording, we get 11.7 stops when viewed on an 8K timeline, which isn't too bad at all, honestly, for a sensor like this. But if we take that 8K image and drop it into a 4K timeline, giving us an improved, downsampled 4K image, we get a bump up to 12.4 stops, which is a solid result and a worthwhile improvement if you have the cards and hardware to work with 8K footage. If instead you opt for the binned 4K in-camera, you can expect about 11.8 clean stops, and slightly worse if you shoot in 4K 60 at 11.5. And then lastly, if you shoot the oversampled APS-C 4K, you can get 12.2 stops right at a camera. Again, no big losers anywhere regarding the modes in this camera. Everything makes sense and is reflective of earlier tests. There are avenues and combinations within this camera to produce an optimal result, but the binned 4K is a reliable option with no crop, better rolling shutter, and decent dynamic range. It has a lower potential quality ceiling, but it's a great option for a no-fuss shooting experience. But let's take a closer look at that noise. When shooting in S-Log3, the camera has a base ISO of 800, but it appears to clean up at ISO 2500, which is where I would place its unofficial second native ISO. It has a maximum standard ISO of 32,000, and I found it usable even at ISO 12,800, but I would avoid pushing it to 25,600 when possible. This isn't what I would call a low light specialist, but you can count on it in most reasonable situations when needed. And thankfully, there are no noticeable hue shifts or color issues, even when shooting as high as 25,600. Color accuracy is superb, and you can easily mix shots with an Alpha 1 or A7 IV. I did, however, find the A7R5 to be slightly more saturated than the Alpha 1 when matching, but bumping the saturation a few points on the A1 made the shots look almost identical. It was also during this test that I was able to see a practical difference in the dynamic range between these cameras when I purposely clipped the highlights in the skin tones equally on each. After recovery, you can see the Alpha 1 retains slightly more of the face than the A7R5 did. The differences are small, but the A1 is slightly superior in this regard, and you'd see a similar result if you compared this new camera to the A7 IV, which also outperforms the R5 in this aspect. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't like the bold, saturated colors of this sensor. I took it on a bit of an autumn photo walk and was quite happy with how rich the images were after using only a basic S-Log3 transform. And while on that walk, I also got a chance to test out the new IBIS system on this camera. Sony claims up to 8 stops of image stabilization with the body alone, which is quite high considering you usually need to combine it with the lens IS to hit those numbers. But I can say, when it comes to video, that I think I did notice an improvement in telephoto handheld shots. I was able to easily hold a shot at 200mm by putting the camera in active mode, and it was rock solid like a tripod. However, when it comes to walking around with the camera, I didn't see a big difference over previous models. Heavy footsteps are still quite noticeable in the frame, and it doesn't float as nicely as Panasonic, for example. It's workable, but not class-leading for those kinds of shots. So my advice would be to use a gimbal if you want smooth walking, but you can rely on the IBIS for long, stable, handheld shots. But keep in mind, the active stabilization mode is not available when shooting 8K. In that mode, you only have standard stabilization, which does make a difference, but doesn't give you that on a tripod feeling quite so much. But let's do a vlog test so you can see the stabilization, rolling shutter, autofocus, and possibly the dynamic range all in action at once. Okay, so here we go. We've got 4K 24, we're using the bin version, so it's completely full frame, but I have active stabilization on, so that's gonna crop in a little bit. We're using a 20mm lens, so if there's any kind of weird, warpy stabilization stuff going on, we should see that. And also rolling shutter wise, that's what the binned 4K rolling shutter looks like. It's not too bad at all, I don't think. You're hearing the audio that's recorded right into the camera from a Rode VideoMic NTG on top. This is what the sky looks like. Dynamic range wise, it's able to keep most of the sky in the shot. Just a couple of the clouds are out. Eye tracking's been locked onto my eye the entire time, and I'm wearing my Sony shill jacket. Thanks for coming to my vlog. Now this camera has more to the autofocus than just the eye tracking. In fact, a big portion of my product brief was spent talking about the autofocus improvements on this camera, so I think it's a big deal for Sony. They added this new AI processing unit to the camera that uses deep learning to, as Sony puts it, dramatically improve subject recognition. In the briefing, they were showing how it can understand human poses and recognize eyes, ears, noses, necks, shoulders, elbows, wrists, hips, knees, and ankles to help with pose estimation and predict human movement. What I noticed when using the camera is that it had a lot more tracking box options when aimed at people and could rapidly move between those different methods. Instead of just face, when my subject turned away from the camera, it would put a box on their back or their head, or even would predict where the eye would be through the back of the head, which was pretty cool. And apparently it works with masks and helmets and other things that obscure the face. And they added a lot more subjects that it can detect. So now you've got human, animal, bird, and animal/bird, which lets you do both at the same time, and you can set the priority between those two. And also insects now. And animals isn't just for pets anymore, but basically any animal. And they can tell the difference between an animal's head and body and eye. Now, I haven't been able to test this thoroughly as there aren't that many different types of animals around me, but it worked well for the things I did point it at, and it worked on Google images of animals too. The insect detection was quite competent as well. Even when I obscured it a bit in the frame with a plant, it managed to track the head and thorax region of the insect, which is pretty impressive. This new system is also supposed to be a lot more tenacious with knowing your specific subject and not confusing it with other similar subjects, whether that's people, animals, or even cars and airplanes. They've added those new subject tracking modes too, and apparently it can tell one car from another and track the front of your car as if it had a face. But if I had to be critical of one aspect of the new system, I would say that it's a bit busy, sometimes frantic, and occasionally paranoia-inducing. When I was doing that follow shot to test the IBIS, there were a lot of boxes moving about. It would put a big box on the back, then the hood, then the hat, then a predictive eye box, then back to the hood, then one time it found a face in the tree off in the distance, then back to the hat. It had me worried that the shot was going to be ruined by the focus constantly changing depths, especially when it went to the tree. Thankfully, when I reviewed the footage, it wasn't actually racking focus to all those different boxes or distant trees. So it seemed like I was merely seeing the calculations and not the actual focusing, which is good, but like I said, paranoia-inducing because I was worried it kept botching my shot. Maybe this is something that I just need to get used to and practice with a bit more, or perhaps Sony will tweak this in firmware as they refine the system. But there is a lot of potential here, that's for sure. Oh, and one time it thought this little guy was an airplane, but what do I know? Maybe he is. Actually, that wasn't the only autofocus blooper I encountered. One time it thought this tree was an animal, another it thought Lindsay was a car, and best of all, that this dog had an eyeball worth tracking on his bananas. But the best part of all this new autofocus stuff is that all of the capabilities and detection methods and subject types are available in both photo and video with no limitations between modes. And I was able to maintain that subject detection all the way down to nearly 5 stops underexposed and keep it all the way up to a good 6 or 7 stops overexposed. So no concerns there. Now I focus primarily on the video capabilities of this camera. This is also a photography monster, and I'm sure there's going to be some great reviews from a photo perspective coming out, but if I can summarize my photography experience with this camera in a sentence or two, I would say that so far, it's probably shaping up to be my favorite photo camera of all time. Maybe that title still belongs to the A1, but if I consider the price difference, this one wins by a mile when value is factored in. It's truly been a pleasure to use, and I love this viewfinder. It's the 9.4 million dot 120 FPS EVF. Like I said, this isn't a review of the photo capabilities, but I've just personally enjoyed my time with it. So this is normally where I would make my value conclusions and wrap up the video, but I find this one a bit tricky. This is easily one of Sony's best cameras they've ever made, but it's not the best value camera in their lineup altogether because you still have cheaper but very capable options in the A7 IV and FX30. And if you want to go full speed with your budget, you've still got the A1, which outpaces this camera in most areas. And you'd hope it would when you consider the price delta. This new camera is a worthy upgrade over its predecessor, the A7R IV, with much better video functionality, better ports, better menu interface, better autofocus, and so on. I guess it's just tough for me to put a label on something that isn't the absolute best performer and isn't the absolute best value either. This sits somewhere in between. But the in between is a camera that I personally love, that is technically excellent, and that's being offered at a fair price when you consider the cost to performance of the models above and below it. And I suppose that's all we can really ask for. Well, that, and for Sony to put focus breathing compensation and animal IAF for video via firmware and other cameras, yes, I'm not letting that go. It's the flagship, Sony. The A1 is the flagship. Why doesn't it have all the features the other cameras have? All right, I'm done.